I'm happy to be able to present the key rule changes for World Para Athletics. And I'm going to talk about general rule changes, competition rules, a little bit about officials, general rules, track rules, field events. And just as a reminder, safety is the most important aspect of para-athletic sport because the athletes tend to have some form of disability that makes them a little bit more vulnerable than able-bodied athletes from the IAAF. You'll also find out that most of the rules, or many of the rules, follow updates from IAAF. Rules came into force January 1st, except the tether rule, the new tether rule, which I will discuss a little bit later. Many of the changes are administrative in nature, and in this presentation, what you'll see are in boldface the changes that are made. Now, also worthy of note that only major and or important changes are noted. And while there are many other changes in the rule book, they won't be included in this presentation. Not all rule changes are outlined in the presentation, so have a look at the new rule book, and I'll send a link to John about where you can get the rule book from World Para Athletics, but it is available right now in English only. In terms of changes, one of the more significant changes is that athletes should wear 2 bibs. They'll be provided with at least 2 bibs. And as the rule says, worn visibly on the breast and the back, except for jumping events where it can be worn on the breast or the back. So that's any jumping event, long, triple, high jump, etc. They only need to wear 1. Now, one of the bibs issued shall be visibly displayed on the back of the wheelchair, throwing frame, or the lateral side of the race running frame. And that's a little bit confusing because in major competitions, the race running is not often contested, and it's a little unusual for many people to see race running. However, it does happen quite regularly in world competitions and will be held in the Olympic Games in 2020. Also, what's important is in some competitions there are 3 bibs issued, and the bibs would be worn according to the technical regulations for the competition itself. Next, we'll move just to re-emphasize that this is not a new rule. However, athletes in T or F11 category must have their eyes or eye cavities completely covered with gauze patches or equivalent material, and must wear opaque glasses or eye masks appropriate for the competition, and they must wear them from the time they leave the call room to the end of the competition, with the exception in field events that an eye mask may be taken off. However, the eye patches must remain until they have gone through the post-event control area. So eye cavities for T11, F11, so that's track events and field events, must be completely covered with gauze patches from the time they leave the call room to the time they get through to the post-event control area. And they must wear their they must wear their eye patches or approved opaque glasses until the until the trial is completed in a field event only. They must wear everything for all track events. I hope that's clear, but it's re-emphasizing a rule that already exists. So they must be worn, as noted here. This is the new part. They must be worn from the time the athlete leaves the call room through to the end of the event. However, they may remove the opaque glasses between trials. Tether rule. When competing with a guide runner, so it could be in sport class T11 and T12, where they decide to compete with a guide runner, it must be through a tether. And the new tether, I'll talk about what it looks like, but the pair must remain attached via tether from the start of the event until after the athlete finishes the event. And just as a comment, this is often easy to see on a photo finish picture, but not always easy to see by the referee who might be at the finish line. However, between the referee and the photo finish chief judge, it's relatively easy to determine if the athlete and the guide are tethered through the finish of the event. This is what the new tether will look like, or very similar to this. The essential elements of the tether are there has to be a minimum of 10 centimeter gap in the center section, and for track events the maximum overall length is 30 centimeters, and for road events the maximum is 50 centimeters. I have seen prototypes of this and it looks fairly similar, except at this point there is no fixed spherical stopper that will, the one just to the left on the it's called, I guess it's called the locking mechanism. There isn't a locking mechanism at this point. They haven't been able to figure that out through the manufacturers. So they have three different types, one for finger holding, one for wrist, and an additional one for a hand hold. So there are different widths of the locking, or the piece on the end that you can see that I'm circling here. Again, in track events, lane infringement, there has been an adjustment to the rule, both IAAF and World Para Athletics. If an athlete steps outside his lane on the straight or the outer line on a curb, the athlete will not necessarily be disqualified. As long as there's no one obstructed, no one's impeded, there won't be a disqualification, and if no material advantage is gained. So coming down a home straight, if an athlete in, say, a 200-meter runs out of lane, as long as they don't obstruct someone, there's not much chance they're going to gain any kind of material advantage. The incident that they're referring to here is actually IAAF, where an athlete in a 4x400-meter relay came down the home straight, ran off the track, passed someone, and then came back onto the track. So obviously a material advantage was gained, and in that case the team was disqualified. So that's the only incident where where an athlete could gain a material advantage, really, where they run off the track to pass someone. So it could happen in the end of an 800-meter, could happen at the end of any middle distance or distance event, or in a 4x4. There is another new event that will be contested in the Tokyo Olympics, which is a universal 4x100-meter relay. And the whole concept of this was to increase National Paralympic Committee participation in relay events and ensure that there is a strong, viable relay event. There have been some difficulties in the past for World Para Athletics to have full fields in relay events, and this seems to be quite popular with the teams. And the first time it was held was in World Para Junior Athletics Championships in Switzerland last summer. And it was quite popular. And because it was the first time it was being held, there was one team that turned out to be a Scandinavian team, as opposed to a team from Norway or Sweden or Finland or Denmark. It was a team composed of representatives from all of those different nations. There's some sort of confusion, and it requires technical staff to be fairly clear and rigorous in reviewing the entrants for the relays when the team composition is identified. The running order is not all that flexible. The first leg is either an athlete from the T11 to T13 class. The second leg is either a T42, 47, or T61 to 64. And just to be clear, those are arm amputees or leg amputees. The T61 to 64 class are those who are running with prosthesis. 42 to 44 are also leg issues, and the 45 to 47 are arm amputees or arm issues. The third leg must be run by a T35 to 38 category, which is generally the cerebral palsy group, and the fourth leg is a wheelchair leg, either T33, 34, or 51 to 54. There must be 2 men and 2 women on the team, and they can compete in whichever leg is appropriate to their level of disability. A maximum of 2 athletes can be in the T13, the 46, 47, the 38, or the 54 category. So a maximum of 2 athletes can compete from the lesser disabled within those groups for those legs, and the remaining 2 can be from any other sport class. I hope that's a little bit clear. It can be a little bit confusing. When they get on the track, it should not be an issue for a track referee or any umpires or officials. It's really the call room and the technical delegates that have to make sure that or along with the competition secretary, that the teams are valid for entering the competition itself. And this is nothing really new, except what used to occur is there used to be an acceleration zone of 10 meters and then a takeover zone of 20 meters. It's now called a takeover zone completely, and it's 30 meters in length, and athletes shall, as everyone's familiar now, start within the takeover zone. The only difference is for athletes who are in wheelchairs, so it's impacted for all relay races for wheelchair athletes. They have a 20-meter acceleration zone and the same 20-meter takeover zone, but it's all combined together that the touch must occur within the 40 meters. And again, wheelchair athletes must commence their run-up from within, or their wheel-up or their warm-up within the takeover zone itself. In field events, if a judge raises the wrong flag to indicate whether a trial is valid or it's invalid, he may reconsider the decision if he believes he raised the incorrect flag. And Perhaps more importantly is that the judge who is holding the flag, usually the chief judge, that they raise the flag after the trial has been completed. Often we see in para events that a chief judge will raise a yellow flag before an athlete has left the long jump landing area, as an example. And it should not be raised until the trial is in fact completed. This is the time allowed for trials. It's been creating difficulties for both IAAF and World Para Athletics, but an athlete must attempt his trial within a certain time period, and we'll get to that in a second. The official responsible this is an important part, shall indicate to an athlete that all is ready and that the period allowed for his trial shall commence. So that's when the time clock starts. If after the time for a trial has begun, an athlete subsequently decides not to attempt the trial, it shall be considered a failure once that time period has expired. So there's nothing really magical other than if an athlete's called and has not yet decided that they're not going to compete, then they must, the time must continue to run out. The time allowed is the same for able-bodied and para, except for seated throws, which is shown on the right-hand side of this particular graphic. So the time is 30 seconds or half a minute for seated throws in all instances, except for seated throws between the third and fourth. If they're throwing 6 consecutive throws, they get 1 minute between the third and fourth, so there's an extra minute. So essentially that time period is 1 minute 30 seconds between the third and the fourth attempt in a seated throwing event. It's worth mentioning that the most difficult of the events for officiating is the club throw for seated throwers. And the important part is that an athlete must be ready and the event site must be ready before the time starts. So often the implement will be handed to the athlete when the athlete says they're ready, and then the 30 seconds shall start. Now, in most throwing events, the athletes throw almost immediately, and it's very rare that an athlete will time out in a throwing event. They tend to want to throw quicker in the club throw, and again, this is a little bit dangerous, but when you hand the club to an athlete who's preparing to throw, the important part is to tell him that when you are out of the area, that it is now safe for him to commence his trial and the clock is starting. So most of it all is initiated by the chief judge or the judge handing the implement to the athlete saying the clock is now starting. Now, if an athlete is reluctant to take the implement, then you hold the implement, present the implement to the athlete, and if the athlete doesn't take it immediately, you do not put it on the athlete's lap. You say the clock is starting in 3, 2, 1. Now the clock has started, and the athlete must take the implement at that point and commence his trial when he's ready. The important part, again, is starting the clock at the appropriate time. When only one athlete who has won the competition and is attempting a world record or other record directly relevant to the competition, the time limit shall be increased by 1 minute, and that's for high jump only. In the seated throws, the time shall begin from the time when the implement has been presented to the athlete. So that's the important part, is presenting the implement to the athlete, as mentioned. Seated throwing requirements. Now, this may seem like an innocuous change, but it used to be a holding bar. It's now being changed to a vertical bar. The importance is the bar must be vertical. It does not have to be perpendicular, but it has to be vertical. It still must be without curves or bends, and as you can see here, there's no change in the cross-sectional profile of the bar. It may have tape on it that makes it easier for an athlete to hold the bar, and in some instances, there are athletes who are allowed to have a glove in their non-throwing hand, and in fact, their non-throwing hand can be affixed to the vertical bar, such as in athletes in class 31 to 33 and 51 to 53. And the reason for this, if you're unclear, is that some of those athletes do not have the same kind of mobility advantages that other athletes do, and it's difficult for them to remain in a seated position if they don't have something to hold on to. Those are effectively the important new rules. If there are any questions, send them along now, and I'll have a look at them and get back to you. But the first thing I will do when I'm off this call is send the link to where the World Para-Athletic rules are. I'll send that link to John, and he can send it out to all of the attendees. The second comment perhaps I will make is that, as with IAAF, major rule changes only occur in the cycle commencing after the Olympic Games. And it's the same for World Para. They don't want to make major changes in the years before the Olympics, but they make the major changes in the years after, which is why the tether rule was gradually introduced, and while other rules tend to be gradually introduced. So thank you all for your participation. I hope you have a good time in judging the few para events that we have in this country. I mean, the biggest one is our national championships, which will be in Montreal for the next 2 years, and then on the West Coast for the 2 years after that. So thank you all. John, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thanks. So we did have one question that came from Serge, which was, what is the difference between wheelchair and race running frames?
It's a good question. I can send out a link to a paper that talks about race running because there is no diagram or picture of a race running frame in the rule book, but the race running frame, race running itself is a standing event for athletes in what we call the categories or sport class 31 and 32. And so it's cerebral palsy athletes with severe disabilities who cannot run. So they have a frame that's it's a taller wheelchair essentially, and they use their feet to propel themselves rather than a wheelchair which uses arms only to propel the athletes. So it's a different event, and it's one that's practiced more in Europe and fairly infrequently practiced in North America. But I believe there's one athlete from New Brunswick who is a race running athlete, and one or two athletes in the United States. So it's not a huge population in North America at this stage, but in Europe there's a large group. So again, simply put, a race running frame is a standing frame where an athlete will run versus an athlete in a wheelchair is propelling himself or herself by use of arm movement. I hope that helps.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If there are, you can type them in the box while you're thinking about that. So this session's been recorded, and it's going to go on athleticscanada.tv. And also I'll send out the links that David mentioned to everyone who took this webinar, and I'll try to have it somehow attached to the recording as well. And we will be doing this, I believe, again next week en français. Is that right, Serge?
Yes. Will be next week.
Next week. Okay. In case anyone wants to hear it in French. All right. Good. Well, thank you, David, for taking the time to do that. Let me just check for final questions here. No, I think that's it. So yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone. That's it.
Okay, thank you all.
Okay.
Sorry it was so quick. I was worried that we wouldn't get through the material, so I kind of whistled through it, and I probably could have added a few more changes, but those are the significant new changes to the rules.
Okay. Good to know. All right. Thank you.